The whispers followed Amelia like a shadow, clinging to the silence her father, Robert, left in his wake. They were there in the grocery store aisle when he walked ahead, pretending not to know the young woman fumbling with a carton of milk. They echoed in the sterile quiet of the doctor's waiting room, where he sat across from her, his gaze fixed on a worn magazine, his face a mask of indifference. "She's just out for attention," a woman murmured to her husband, her voice a stage whisper designed to be heard. "Some children are so dramatic." Amelia's heart, a fragile thing, would clench with a familiar ache. Attention was the last thing she craved. All she wanted was a flicker of recognition, a simple acknowledgement that she existed in her father's world. But for the past 5 years, since the day her mother had passed, she had been a ghost in her own home. Robert had not disappeared. He was a constant, solid presence. He cooked, he cleaned, he provided. But he did so with a chilling, mechanical efficiency, his eyes always looking through her, past her, as if she were a pane of glass. The silence began subtly. In the raw, immediate aftermath of the funeral, Amelia had attributed his withdrawal to grief. She would try to breach the wall he was building, bringing him tea, asking about his day, showing him an old photograph of them with her mother, their faces bright with a happiness that now felt like a relic from another life. He would offer a curt nod, a monosyllabic reply, or simply walk out of the room, leaving her standing with the cooling mug or the framed memory in her hands, the silence in the room heavier than before. As months bled into years, the silence solidified, becoming an unbreachable fortress. He stopped saying her name. Birthdays came and went without a card, without a happy birthday, without so much as a shared glance over the single cupcake she bought for herself. The house, once filled with her mother's laughter and the scent of her baking, became a museum of unspoken words and hollow moments. The most painful part was the performance for the outside world. To neighbors and distant relatives, Robert would speak of her, but always in the abstract. "My daughter is doing well in school," he'd say, his voice detached, as if reporting on a stranger. But when Amelia was present, the curtain fell, and he would ignore her completely. Her attempts to understand became more desperate. She left notes on his pillow, letters on the kitchen table, pouring out her confusion and pain. "Dad, what did I do wrong? Please, just talk to me." The notes would vanish, unanswered. The letters would be found in the trash, unread. It was a slow metadichne stirania, an emotional annihilation that left her feeling unmoored and worthless. The world began to shrink, her confidence eroding with every averted gaze. At school, she struggled to connect with friends, the shame of her father's rejection a constant hum beneath the surface of every conversation. How could she explain that her own father looked at her as if she were nothing? The accusation that she was seeking attention became a recurring theme, a painful brand seared onto her skin by the casual cruelty of strangers. It happened at a parent-teacher conference, where Robert stood silently in the corner while her teacher praised her work. The teacher, unnerved by his silence, shot Amelia a look of pity mixed with suspicion. It happened at a community picnic when she tried to join his conversation with a neighbor, only for him to turn his back to her, leaving her standing awkwardly on the edge of the circle. The neighbor's wife patted her arm. "He's a quiet man, dear. Don't push him." The implication was clear. She was the problem. She was too loud, too needy, too much. She was the one out for attention. The breaking point came on the eve of her high school graduation. It was a milestone, a moment that should have been filled with pride and shared joy. She had her cap and gown laid out on her bed, her valedictorian speech memorized, a fragile bubble of hope expanding in her chest. Perhaps this, she thought, would be the thing to finally break the spell. Perhaps seeing her on that stage, hearing her words, would remind him that she was his daughter. She found him in the living room, reading the newspaper. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My graduation is tomorrow. It starts at 6. I was hoping you'd be there." Robert did not lower the paper. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the rustle of the page as he turned it. Then, without looking at her, he spoke, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I have a prior engagement." The bubble of hope didn't just pop. It shattered, the pieces raining down on her like shards of glass. A prior engagement. The words were so cold, so dismissive, they stole the air from her lungs. She stared at the top of his head, the familiar graying hair, and something inside her finally snapped. The years of suppressed sobs, of swallowed pleas, of enduring the weight of his indifference, erupted in a wave of raw, unfiltered anguish. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. A strange, chilling calm settled over her. She simply turned and walked out the door, leaving the cap and gown, the speech, and the ghost of a daughter he had created behind her. She would go to her graduation alone, and from that day forward, she would learn to be alone. Leaving her childhood home was not a singular act of rebellion, but the first step in a long, arduous journey of self-reclamation. Amelia attended her graduation alone. She walked onto the stage, her head held high, and delivered her valedictorian speech with a voice that was clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil that raged within her. She spoke of futures and possibilities, of building lives of purpose. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she did not search for her father. For the first time, she was speaking for herself, and the realization was both terrifying and liberating. The years that followed were a testament to her resilience. She took a small room in a boarding house on the other side of town, working 2 jobs to pay her rent and save for college. The first job was at a diner, where the clatter of plates and the constant chatter of strangers provided a welcome noise that drowned out the silence she had grown up with. The second was at the local library, a quiet sanctuary where she found solace in the stories of others. The characters in the books became her companions, their triumphs and tragedies a balm to her own wounded spirit. She put herself through community college, then a 4-year university, studying social work. The choice felt inevitable. She was drawn to the voiceless, the overlooked, the people who, like her, had been made to feel invisible. Her own pain became a source of empathy, a bridge that connected her to the clients she served. She learned to listen, truly listen, to the unspoken words, to the language of a downcast gaze or a pair of trembling hands. She gave to others what she had been so desperately denied: validation. A decade passed. Amelia, now in her late 20s, had built a life for herself in a city 100 miles away from her hometown. She had a small but comfortable apartment, a job she was passionate about, and a close-knit circle of friends who knew her as a kind, if somewhat reserved, woman. They knew she was estranged from her father, but she never offered the details, and they were wise enough not to press. The wound was still there, a deep foundational scar that had shaped the person she had become. She rarely cried over it anymore, but it ached on quiet nights, or when she saw a father and daughter sharing a simple, easy laugh. She had not seen or spoken to Robert in 10 years. There were no calls, no letters, no attempts at contact from either side. She had accepted the void. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp, official-looking envelope that felt cold to the touch. It was a court order. Her father was petitioning to sell the family home, and as her mother's heir, her signature was legally required. The news landed not with a crash, but with a dull, heavy thud in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the forced reunion, the reopening of a door she had long since sealed shut. Her first instinct was to fight it, to hire a lawyer and refuse out of principle. Why should she make his life easier now? But as she sat with the letter, a different feeling emerged, a weary resignation. Fighting it would only prolong the connection, keeping her tethered to him through legal battles and paperwork. The only way to be truly free was to face it one last time, to sign the papers, and to sever the final tie. Her friends rallied around her. "You don't have to do this alone," said Maria, her closest confidant. "I'll go with you." Amelia shook her head. "Thank you, but this is something I have to do myself. It's the last chapter. I need to close the book." The drive back to her hometown was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every landmark, every street corner, held a memory. There was the park where her mother had taught her to ride a bike, Robert cheering from the sidelines. There was the ice cream shop where they had celebrated good report cards, her father ruffling her hair with a proud smile. These memories from before the silence were the most painful of all. They were a reminder of the man he had once been, the father she had lost long before her mother had died. The courthouse was an imposing, soulless building. As she walked up the stone steps, she smoothed down her professional attire, a suit of armor for the battle ahead. She was no longer the fragile, pleading girl he had ignored. She was a woman who had built her own world from the ashes of his neglect. She saw him as soon as she entered the courtroom. He was smaller than she remembered, his shoulders stooped, his hair completely white. He looked old and frail, and for a fleeting moment a pang of something akin to pity stirred within her. But then he looked up, his gaze sweeping past her without a flicker of recognition, and the pity vanished, replaced by the familiar cold ache of invisibility. He was seated with his lawyer, looking straight ahead at the judge's bench, as if she were just another piece of the courtroom furniture. The whispers started almost immediately, ripples in the quiet room. "That's the daughter," someone murmured from the public gallery. "I heard she hasn't spoken to him in years, just abandoned him." The old narrative, the cruel, misinformed judgment, had followed her even here. She was the villain. She was the one out for attention. Amelia took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and sat down with her own lawyer, ready for the final act to begin. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, surveyed the room. Her name was Judge Eleanor Vance, and she had a reputation for being thorough, for looking beyond the black and white of the law to the gray, often messy, truth of human lives. The case before her was, on the surface, a simple property dispute. A petition to sell, a co-owner's required consent. It should have taken 15 minutes. But her clerk had flagged it, noting the long-term estrangement and the fact that the defendant had been located via a private investigator. It was a small town. Stories and whispers traveled fast. Judge Vance had heard a version of the story of Robert and Amelia, and she was not one to take such matters at face value. "We are here to address Petition 734, she began, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. "A request by Mr. Robert Sterling to sell the property at 12 Orchard Lane. The co-owner, Ms. Amelia Sterling, is present." "Ms. Sterling," she said, turning her attention to Amelia, "what is your position on this matter?" Amelia stood, her hands clasped behind her back. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even and clear, "I am prepared to sign the documents. I have no objection to the sale of the house." A ripple of surprise went through the gallery. They had come expecting a fight, a dramatic confrontation. Judge Vance, however, merely nodded, her expression unreadable. "You understand that by signing you relinquish all claims to the property and its contents?" "I do, Your Honor." "And you are not doing so under any form of duress?" A bitter, ironic smile touched Amelia's lips for a fraction of a second. "The only duress, Your Honor, has been the journey to get here. I am ready for this to be over." Judge Vance held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then she turned to the other side of the room. "Mr. Sterling, do you have anything to add?" Robert's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, stood up. "Your Honor, my client is pleased that his daughter is being reasonable. We simply wish to expedite the process. Mr. Sterling is elderly and wishes to settle his affairs." "I was addressing your client, counsel," Judge Vance said, her tone sharp enough to make the lawyer flinch and sit back down. She looked directly at Robert, who had yet to move or show any sign that he was even aware of Amelia's presence. "Mr. Sterling, this is the first time you are seeing your daughter in 10 years. Is there nothing you wish to say to her?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every eye was on Robert. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met Amelia's. They were cold, empty. It was the same look he had given her for years, the look that said, "You are nothing to me." "No, Your Honor," Robert said, his voice raspy from disuse. "There is nothing." Amelia's carefully constructed armor cracked. She didn't gasp, she didn't flinch, but a deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. To be seen, finally, only to be dismissed with such finality, was a cruelty she hadn't prepared for. It was a public execution of a relationship that had died in private long ago. The whispers in the gallery swelled again, this time with a note of shock. Even to them, his coldness was jarring. Judge Vance stared at Robert, her expression hardening. She had seen a lot in her years on the bench: acrimonious divorces, bitter custody battles, families torn apart by greed. But she had rarely witnessed such a complete and chilling void of parental affection. She shuffled the papers in front of her. "In the preliminary filings for this case," she said, her voice taking on a new, deliberate cadence, "counsel for the petitioner submitted a number of documents pertaining to Mr. Sterling's financial and personal state. It is standard procedure. Among them was a box of personal effects, mostly old financial records, tax returns, and this." From the stack of files, she lifted a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was a simple journal, the kind one might find in any stationery shop. It looked old, the leather creased and softened with time. Robert, who had been a statue of indifference, suddenly stiffened. A flicker of something, panic, fear, flashed in his eyes for the first time. His lawyer, sensing his client's distress, started to rise. "Your Honor, that's a personal item. Surely it's not relevant to—" "I will be the judge of what is relevant, counsel." Judge Vance cut him off, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. "You submitted this box as part of your discovery. It is now part of the court's record for this proceeding, and I find one particular entry to be highly relevant." She opened the journal, her gaze scanning a specific page. The courtroom held its breath. Amelia watched, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She had never seen that journal before. What could it possibly contain? Judge Vance looked up, first at Robert, whose face had gone pale, then at Amelia, whose expression was a mixture of confusion and dread. "This journal was kept by your late wife, Mr. Sterling, is that correct?" Robert gave a jerky, almost imperceptible nod. "Most of it contains what one would expect," the judge continued. "Notes about her garden, recipes, appointments. But there is one section at the very back. It is written in a different hand. Your hand, Mr. Sterling. It appears you continued to write in it after her death." She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. Then she read the title of the page that was open before her. Her voice was steady, but it carried an immense weight, a gravity that seemed to pull all the air from the room. "It is titled," she said, her eyes finding Amelia's across the silent courtroom, "My Regret." The two words hung in the air, heavy and resonant. My regret. They were an anchor, pulling a decade of unspoken history to the surface with the force of a tidal wave. Judge Vance's gaze was fixed on Robert, whose carefully constructed composure had not just cracked, but utterly shattered. The mask of indifference was gone, incinerated in an instant, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a man whose deepest secret had just been laid bare before the world. "Your Honor, I object," his lawyer sputtered, stumbling to his feet. "This is a flagrant violation of my client's privacy. This has no bearing on the sale of a house." "Sit down, counsel," Judge Vance commanded, her voice low and dangerous, a clear sign that her patience had expired. "Your client submitted this box of documents into evidence. As of that moment, everything in it became relevant. And this," she held the journal up slightly, "this has all the bearing. It is the heart of this entire tragic matter." She turned her attention back to the worn leather book, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The entry is not dated," she said, her voice now a gentle but relentless current, "but it appears to have been written not long after his wife's passing." She began to read, and with each word Amelia felt a piece of her own history being rewritten. "They say the house is full of her memories, but they are wrong. The house is empty. The memories are in my daughter, Amelia." Amelia's breath hitched. He had written her name. In the secret pages of her mother's journal, he had written her name. "She has Sarah's eyes. When she looks at me, it is Sarah looking at me. She has Sarah's smile, the same one that I saw across a crowded room and fell in love with, the same one I saw in the hospital bed when she told me she wasn't afraid. But I am afraid. Every time Amelia laughs, I hear Sarah's last breath. Every time she tells me she loves me, I hear the promise I made to her, to always protect them both, a promise that turned to ash in my mouth. It was a confession." Amelia felt her legs weaken, and she gripped the edge of her table for support. It wasn't hate she had seen in his eyes all those years. It was fear. He wasn't looking through her. He was looking at a ghost. Across the room, Robert had folded in on himself, his face buried in his hands. A low, guttural moan escaped him, the sound of a wound that had been festering for years. The judge's voice never wavered. She was a conduit for the truth, and she would see it delivered. "I thought the silence would be a shield. I thought if I did not look at her, I would not see her mother's ghost. If I did not speak to her, I would not have to hear the echo of my failure. I became a machine. I provided. I cooked. I cleaned. I did the functions of a father, but I removed the heart because the heart was broken. I told myself I was protecting myself from the pain, but I was a fool. I was a coward. I have walled myself into a tomb of my own making, and my greatest sin is that I have buried my daughter in here with me." Amelia was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face, but they were not the hot tears of rejection she had cried into her pillow for years. These were tears of a staggering, painful, world-altering revelation. The entire foundation of her identity, the unloved daughter, the attention seeker, the girl who was fundamentally flawed, crumbled into dust. She wasn't a burden to him because he didn't care. She was a burden because he cared too much, and his grief had become a poison that had twisted his love into something unrecognizable. Judge Vance paused, taking a breath before reading the final, devastating lines of the entry. "She thinks I do not see her, but I see her every day. I see her strength, her kindness, her resilience. I see Sarah's spirit living in her, and I am so proud it hurts. It hurts to be proud of a daughter you have pushed away. The world will see her grow into a remarkable woman, and they will not know that her father was a man who loved her so much he could not bear to look at her. My name is Robert Sterling, and my regret is that I chose the ghost of my wife over the living, breathing miracle she left behind. My regret is Amelia." The judge closed the journal, the soft thud of the leather cover sounding like a final, merciful gavel in the silent room. Robert was sobbing uncontrollably now, the raw, wretched sound of a man who had held back a flood for more than a decade. He was no longer the cold, indifferent figure of authority. He was a broken old man, drowning in a grief he had never allowed himself to process. Judge Vance looked from the weeping father to the stunned daughter, her expression filled with a deep, judicial sadness. "This court will take a recess," she announced softly. "The documents can be signed in my chambers when the parties are ready." She rose and walked out without another word, leaving a profound and heavy silence in her wake. One by one, the others left. Amelia's lawyer gave her a gentle, supportive nod. Robert's lawyer cast a pitying glance at his client and retreated. The gallery, which had come for drama, filed out in somber silence, humbled by the raw, private pain they had witnessed. Soon, they were alone. The vast courtroom, which had felt so intimidating just moments before, now felt like a sanctuary, a quiet, hollowed-out space for this final, impossible reckoning. For a long moment, Amelia didn't move. Her mind raced, replaying every averted gaze, every unanswered letter, every birthday without a word. It was all recontextualized, a mosaic of pain seen now through the lens of this heartbreaking truth. The anger, the bitter resentment that had been her shield for so long had evaporated, leaving behind a vast, aching pity. She looked at the shaking, pathetic figure of her father. He had not built a wall to keep her out. He had built it to keep his pain in. And she had been on the other side, throwing herself against the stones, believing they were meant for her. Slowly, she stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, as if she were learning to walk again. She crossed the room, her quiet footsteps echoing on the polished floor. She stopped beside his chair. He did not look up, his face still hidden in his hands, ashamed to be seen in his utter brokenness. What could she say? The words, "I forgive you," felt too simple. A lie. Forgiveness was a mountain she had not yet begun to climb. "I understand," felt closer, but still inadequate for the chasm between them. So, she said the one word that had been a barrier between them for so long, a word she had yearned to hear and he had refused to say. "Dad?" His sobbing hitched, a sharp intake of breath. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his hands. He lifted his head. His eyes, red-rimmed and flooded with a decade of unshed tears, finally met hers. And for the first time since she was a girl, he didn't look through her. He saw her. In his gaze, she saw it all. The ghost of his wife, the unbearable grief, the pride that hurt, and the profound, suffocating regret. He couldn't speak. Words were useless now. He just reached out a trembling hand, an offering and a plea. Amelia took it. His skin was cold, his hand frail, but his grip was surprisingly strong, as if he were a drowning man holding on for dear life. And in that simple, silent touch, a decade of silence began to dissolve. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where all was forgotten. It was a beginning, a fragile, painful, but possible beginning. An hour later, in the quiet of Judge Vance's chambers, they signed the papers. Amelia's signature was firm and steady next to Robert's, which was shaky and uncertain. As he passed the pen back to her, their eyes met again. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the debt he owed her, a debt that could never be repaid, only accepted. The act of signing was no longer one of severing a painful tie, but of closing a chapter together. They were letting go of a house to perhaps finally start rebuilding a home. As Amelia walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, the world felt different. The weight that she had carried on her shoulders for so long, the weight of being unseen and unloved, was gone. The truth hadn't erased the scars of the past, but it had illuminated them, made sense of them. She was not a girl who was out for attention. She was a daughter who had been loved so fiercely, so brokenly, that it had almost destroyed them both. The old story was finally over, and a new one, unwritten and uncertain, was just beginning. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might be carrying a silent burden. Sometimes the deepest regrets are hidden behind the coldest silence, and the most powerful truths, the ones that can heal a lifetime of pain, are waiting to be read on a single tear-stained page.